Shalom, shalom, wonderful friends. Chag Sameach and Moadim L'Simcha. Wonderful to see you on this very special week of Pesach. Very excited. We're keeping our learning together going. We always VBM always keeps the lights on. Wherever we are, whatever's happening on the calendar in the world, we're always keeping Jewish learning going together. So thank you for being here. And I know my colleague Alex is facilitating from the Holy Land. So I'm glad she could still be with us today as well. Today's topic is neurodivergence and neurodiversity. Hard to believe we're already at session 23. I've got about 10 sessions. I'm about 10 sessions ahead in preparation, but we're catching up. So let's start with a poll question. Okay, humans are fundamentally very much the same, very different. Most people are mostly the same, but there's a minority that are very different. What do you think? Are most people very much the same fundamentally, very different fundamentally, or are most people mostly the same, but there's a minority that are very different? Okay, 25% say humans are fundamentally very much the same. 50% say humans are fundamentally very different, and 25% say humans are fundamentally most people. I guess the sentence doesn't make sense, but most people are mostly the same, but there is a minority that are very different. Okay, very interesting. So we're going to look at neurodivergence and neurodiversity together. So each of us experiences the world a little differently. And we can't say that one way is necessarily more right than the other. The concept of neurodiversity acknowledges exactly this, the diverse varieties of ways that people may interact with others, their environment, and themselves. Neurodiversity movement emerged in the 1990s. When it comes to those who think, learn, and behave in a way that is not considered in line with social norms, the model of neurodiversity, unlike some traditional models of mental health, does not view differences as deficits. To be clear, neurodiversity does not refer to an individual's identity, but is rather a way to acknowledge the diverse experiences of all people. By the way, I think back on just how much language has changed over the recent decades. I was reading my grandfather's obituary recently, and he was the president of the Retards Association. Already when I was a kid, a retard was so derogatory. I don't know when that began, but he was the president of the Retards Association. It was like, and that was like a noble thing. It wasn't like a joke, So our language is constantly shifting on these things. Before I delve further into this topic, though, I want to state clearly that I'm not a mental health expert, although I've been trained as a pastor for 4 years and did a doctorate in psychology. I'm not a medical doctor or a counselor, or a neurologist or a public health expert, of course. I can't elucidate neurodiversity on any of those terms other than being a student of those terms. What I can offer, however, is a Torah perspective on neurodiversity, which is what I'm seeking to do today with you. First, by sharing a little bit on the work of others in the neurodiversity movement, then by weaving in some Torah ideas. Neurodiversity acknowledges there are neurotypical people, those who do not demonstrate or experience atypical patterns of behavior and thought, and neurodivergent people, those who do demonstrate or experience atypical patterns of behavior or in thought. It's kind of like those who call themselves cisgender today or non-binary. Over here, we'd call ourselves neurotypical and neurodivergent. One is not better than the other, but one is more typical than the other. Preferable to referring to someone in a disparaging way, neurodivergent is an inclusive, non-judgmental word for individuals whose brains process, learn, or behave in a way that somehow diverges from what is considered typical by society and the medical establishment. It does not refer to any one diagnosis, but is often in association with autism and ADHD. For those living with autism and ADHD, neurodivergent is often their preferred way to describe themselves and their access needs. That said, The term can also be used by those who do not have a formal diagnosis, but who experience traits associated with those diagnoses and who thus identify as being part of the neurodivergent community. The movement really kicked off in 1997 when Australian sociologist Judy Singer coined the term neurodiversity. Singer was born in 1951 in Hungary to a Jewish mother who had survived the Holocaust. The Singer family ultimately relocated to Australia. Singer has said that growing up, she noticed that her mother behaved differently from others. Maybe we all thought our mothers were a little different than the others. It was like she came from another planet or another dimension, Singer told the Guardian newspaper in an interview. I started thinking that when I was quite young, I thought she came from somewhere where the rules were very much simpler. She didn't understand our rules. Later in her life, as Singer was raising an autistic daughter, she continued to think about how much of our society is organized for people whose brains work a certain way, that society's expectations, institutions, and attitudes make it almost impossible for people experiencing mental differences to thrive. It's clear that neurodiversity is not just a word, it's a movement, political movement for people who want their human rights. It's kind of like, imagine you're a black kid being raised in America and every commercial you saw, every actor and actress was white. Or you're a woman and every politician you see in a certain generation is a man. Or, you're queer and every show only shows straight people. So too, there's a neurodivergent world where people feel like they're not represented, like the world doesn't speak to them, isn't catered to them. Historically, people who do not experience what we now call neurodivergence might simply refer to themselves as normal. I'm normal and you're not normal. However, in keeping with the values of neurodiversity movement, it's become more acceptable for people to use the term neurotypical, as we said, to describe a person without developmental differences. The neurotypical person may have less of a sensitivity to the needs and experiences of the neurodivergent person, as many of us are conditioned to believe that all people think and act like us. Thus, the role of the neurotypical person is to gain some sensitivity and empathy for the neurodivergent. There's a lot of measures that neurotypical people can take to be more inclusive to the neurodivergent. First, we might not assume that you'll be able to tell if someone is neurodivergent when you meet them. There's many cases where neurodivergence is not always perceivable to the outside observer, such as a high-functioning autistic person. Many expressions of neurodivergence might not be immediately apparent, such as people with anxiety, depression, bipolar, OCD, epilepsy. Of course, there's some cases where neurodivergence will become clear after a few moments of interaction. Still, other expressions of neurodivergence may be periodic and not constant. Therefore, although you should, of course, display sensitivities when you notice someone's neurodivergence, you never want to assume someone's status based on one single interaction. What's more, many neurodivergent people, and people on the autism spectrum in particular, have learned to do something called masking. The UK's National Autistic Society defines masking as strategy used by some autistic people, consciously or unconsciously, to appear non-autistic. Tactics of masking may include forcing yourself to make eye contact, changing tone to a voice to appear more or less animated, imitating non-literal small talk, and reducing visible reactions to sensory issues, such as non-flinching when someone shakes your hand. Masking might also require an autistic person to force themselves to stop stimming, which is the shortened form of self-stimulatory behaviors. Self-soothing technique. It refers to repetitive movements such as rocking, drumming fingers, tapping, and sometimes repetitive noises such as humming. While masking strategies may help autistic people get by at work, school, or socially, the effort can be utterly exhausting and have devastating impacts on mental health and a sense of self. For some autistic people, masking can even delay or prevent them from getting an autism diagnosis and the support they need. It's notable that one of the main reasons autistic people feel the need to mask is because of lack of sensitivity from neurotypical people who might deem their behavior weird or inappropriate. By the way, there's this woman that when I go to a certain Starbucks, she's always burping really loud, and she does other things that other people think is just rude. It's very clear, having encountered her a few dozen times, that something else is going on there. And so I see people look at her and roll their eyes at her because it's the first time they've encountered her. And there's many things like that, perhaps. Some people might just be rude, but other people may be neurotypical. Ironically, many neurotypical people stim. They do things like hair twirling, nail biting, pacing, or jiggling their legs, which are all stimming behaviors in both neurodivergent and neurotypical people. The more time you spend learning about the behavior of so-called neurodivergent people, the more you may find that although there's certainly a range of behaviors considered typical, there's no one person who is entirely typical in every way. In this way, the neurodiversity movement grants everyone some space to be themselves and ask for the accommodations they need. Not just neurodivergent people, but also people who consider themselves neurotypical. I think of twitches. Most of us have some kind of twitch, whether we're aware of it or not aware of it. Neurodivergence is much more common than many people think. It's estimated that 15 to 20% of the world's population is neurodivergent. In the US, an estimated 6% of adults aged 18 years and older have an ADHD diagnosis. That's equivalent to 1 in every 16 US adults, or 15.5 million people. It's estimated that over 11% of children aged 3 to 17 years have been diagnosed with ADHD. That's 7 million children. When it comes to autism, about 2.2% of American adults have autism spectrum disorder. Rates of autism in American children have climbed in the last 2 decades. Today, it's reported that approximately 1 in every 36 US children has an autism diagnosis. In 2004, the reported rate was 1 in 125 children. Like, that's only 20 years ago, going from 1 in 125 to 1 in 36. That begs some questions. That would indicate these numbers have more than tripled. However, it should be pointed out that data around neurodivergence is often manipulated and misinterpreted to spread false claims about neurodivergence, autism especially, and to further the narrative that neurodivergence is always a disease to be cured, as opposed to a difference to be accommodated, even celebrated. For example, there have been repeated false claims that 50% of children will be autistic by 2050, generally as part of larger anti-vaccine fear-mongering efforts. This claim has been repeatedly debunked. Another consideration for the rise in rates of neurodivergence is that the medical establishment may well have gotten better at diagnosing. There's, of course, no medical test for autism. Rather, it relies on the identification of several indicators by a professional in session with the patient. I encourage everyone, regardless of ability, to approach the topic of neurodiversity with humility. It's very easy for neurotypical people to think that inclusivity is a question of being charitable. However, the truth is that many neurodivergent people have truly unique ways of experiencing the world. It's true that some neurodivergent people may have a condition that requires treatment. However, there's a difference between acknowledging someone's needs and pathologizing their condition. We who are neurotypical should not look at the neurodiverse with pity, but rather with humbleness of knowing that the access needs of neurodiverse people help reveal to us assumptions and biases in society that hurt everyone, not just neurodivergent people. Because as we move into Torah, one thought around Pesach is 4 children. Perhaps we can read the 4 sons, not just as wise and wicked and, intellectually simple and so checked out that they can't ask any questions, but read the 4 children as through this lens of neurodivergency. How does Torah learning change based upon neurodivergence? When it comes to Torah, the values of inclusion and diversity are all over traditional Jewish sources. The prophet Isaiah said in the name of God, "My house shall be called a house for all peoples." For all peoples, it does not say for people who think a certain way or behave a certain way or follow certain social cues a certain way. Indeed, Judaism celebrates that each of us is different. This is also part of VBM's pluralism. Pluralism at VBM means religious diversity. It means political diversity within bounds of bracketing extremism, where people want to hurt people. It means pluralism in identities. It means pluralism in this regard that we're discussing today as well, in terms of people learning differently. The Talmud compares humans to coins struck from the mold of Adam, the first man. However, the rabbis note that while coins look more or less alike, no two humans are the same, the Talmud says. The King of Kings, the Holy One, made each person in the image of Adam, and yet not one of them resembles their fellows. What a fascinating Talmudic passage that demonstrates that all people are equal while still all people are different and unique. Jewish tradition is quite concerned with how different learners are accommodated and supported in their learning. Sefer Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, tells us, teach a child according to their way. Some interpreters, such as Rashi, understand this verse as meaning train a child on the proper way to go. However, in the words al pi darko, I see the possibility that we're being told to teach every child in the way that will be most meaningful and supportive to that child. This might mean, for example, allowing children to stim in class rather than forcing them to sit still and not self-soothe, right? So if I was with one of my daughters and wanted to do a Pesach Seder, we would be drawing art while talking about the Exodus. If I was playing with one of my sons while talking about this, we'd be passing a ball while discussing this, right? If I was talking with my other daughter, we would be singing lyrics. If I was talking with my other son, we'd be like wrestling on the floor while talking about like wrestling Pharaoh or something. Like literally their ability to learn in radically different ways, right? And if I was discussing it with my wife, we'd be having a tea, looking eye to eye on a couch with a blanket. That's the way she would like to talk about the Exodus. So, and if it's me, it would be at a rapid fire pace of debates where we're all just cutting each other off and arguing and, you know. Anyways, Jackie Eldry, author of Moving Forward, Reflections on Autism, Neurodiversity, Brain Surgery, and Faith, has spent years thinking about Jewish education and autism. He has made meaningful suggestions about how to make sure that neurodivergent children feel more included in Jewish learning spaces, especially when it comes to teaching neurodivergence and prayer. One suggestion is that prayer should never be used as punishment to correct improper behavior, such as a child's trouble focusing on or dissociation. Rather, educators ought to place an emphasis on emunah, on belief in the school curriculum. Doing so, she argues, will allow students to feel more empowered in their practice of Judaism, regardless of the challenges they may face in concentrating on prayer. We're told in Vayikra, in Leviticus, you will not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You will not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. This verse has two deep implications for neurodivergence. Regarding not insulting the deaf, we might find this to be redundant at first glance because, as Rashi points out, as Jews we were already instructed in Exodus 22 that we should not curse any fellow. However, that is exactly the point, that regardless of ability or perception of the world, each person is entitled to the same fundamental dignity and respect. When we treat a person with difference with less respect, we're violating the mitzvot. Regarding the stumbling block before the blind, I see in this a reminder that just because we need to treat everyone with equal dignity, we must not imagine that each person requires the same accommodations. What would not be a stumbling block to one person might really trip up another, and vice versa. By the way, this verse is not treated in the Jewish tradition literally, at least the second half of it. The rabbis are not so interested in whether someone is going to put like the rock in front of a blind person because only a cruel person would do that. The Torah doesn't have to command that. What they're really dealing with here is enabling someone to do wrong that they wouldn't do on their own, right? It would be like selling a weapon to someone dangerous who couldn't get that weapon otherwise, or giving really unhealthy food to a kid all the time who has no other choice, right? It's essentially being an enabler. Anyways, some Jewish thinkers have even begun to identify figures from the Bible and Talmud with modern diagnoses. To be clear, these are not attempts to diagnose deceased Jewish figures. Rather, finding neurodiversity in Torah helps us all realize that neurodiversity has always been part of the human experience and that it's reflected in our most ancient and sacred texts. One of the leaders of this approach is Leah Ahava Weintraub, who's pictured here. And by the way, I don't know that previous author, and I don't know her either, who also goes by the Autistic Rebbitzin on her Facebook page and her YouTube channel. She goes by Autistic Rebbitzin. Like many women, she was diagnosed later in life. She's often outspoken about her own experiences as a neurodivergent person, helping to break the stigmas around neurodivergence in some traditional Jewish communities. Rebbetzin Weintraub has made an argument that Moses displays distinctly autistic traits in the Bible. Right? You ever heard that? Moses as autistic? Looking specifically at the way Moses seems to have the autistic experience of sensory overload, for example, in Deuteronomy 14, when he falls to the floor at the deception of the spies. Again, the only way to diagnose someone with autism is for a professional to interact with them indirectly. Like it's always interesting when people, say that Joseph has this diagnosis or, Abraham has this diagnosis, but, we say that with some humility. When Rebbetzin Weintraub is really offering us here as a way to view Moshe through an autistic lens, how that might give us more context for his difficulties in, for example, relating to the Jewish people. He clearly over and over has trouble relating to the people, partially because of their own complexity and complaints, and partially because it may just be that he sees the world so differently. Truly, there's something beautiful in every Jew having the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the Torah uniquely, including experiences that are deeply familiar to those on the autism spectrum. Rabbi Shais Taub has made powerful comparisons between relationships that some neurodivergent people have with reality and the perfectionism of Beit Shammai and the Talmud. As a reminder, Beit Shammai is the Talmudic school of thought that emphasizes stringency, self-discipline, truth, literalness, as opposed to the more lenient and less literal approach of Beit Hillel. Right? One of the most famous cases, just to remind you, is how to light the menorah. Do we light starting with 8 and going down, or do we light with 1 and going up? Some say this makes Beit Shammai more difficult, judgmental, and even mean, but others say that Shammai's stringency comes from a desire to embody the perfection of heaven on earth, while Hillel's approach is more connected to the here and now, as opposed to the world to come. So too, neurotypical people may be more committed to the daily realities of social cues and small talk that we all live with. While some neurodivergent people who find those cues and mores incomprehensible might, like Shammai, be more connected with how things could be. To be clear, nobody wants to traffic in the exoticization or fetishization of neurodivergent people as somehow magical. Rather, such a theory is a reminder that we all have different relationships to reality, and that this should allow us to be patient with each other and even grateful for difference. By the way, there was someone who was clearly neurodivergent in town 2 blocks away from me. For the last few days, I've been seeing this 18-year-old just sitting in a chair by the mailbox. And I went and talked to him yesterday about why he sits by the mailbox. He says he's visiting from New York, and he heard that Phoenix has Waymos, and he's going to spend all his time here counting how many Waymos he pass by, right? Which does sound like fun, but sounds more like something, someone 90 might do, sit by the mailbox as opposed to an 18-year-old. But I was very intrigued, and we had a nice conversation about his experience of that. Regarding the transformative possibilities for reading Torah through an autistic lens, Rabbanit Dr. Liz Shane, who actually we've had here at VBM, and she's done fascinating work on artificial intelligence and the golem, who is public about her autism diagnosis, has written about autistic Torah, which she calls Torah of the details, i.e. reading with incredible focus and precision. For example, those of us who have practiced autistic Torah, she looks to Talmudic rabbis such as Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, who knew 300 laws regarding the magical planting of cucumbers. The comparison here refers to the autistic trait of sometimes developing a special interest, which leads to an intent focus on a specific topic. In Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus's case, cucumbers, that may create some social awkwardness when the autistic person tries to share their special interest. By the way, OCD, many Jews struggle with OCD around Passover time. And there are some really disturbing OCD religious beliefs. There's a guy that I worked with about 6 years ago who was raised in an interfaith home and wanted to very much embrace the Jewish side. But he learned as a kid he'd burn in hell for eternity if he didn't embrace Jesus Christ as his savior. And he had nightmares every night about it. And he was autistic and struggled with OCD and had a number of challenges he was experiencing. And he couldn't get this thought out of his head. And he went to therapist after therapist. And sadly, I mean, this is some of the problem of the therapy world, since we're talking about psychology. Some of those therapists were Christian leaning and were trying to reinforce I mean, it's just so disturbing. Reinforce the fears he had. Others just, and then he would meet with rabbis who would just deal with it as a theological issue, didn't see how deeply, impacted he was. This is not just convincing someone of theology. Anyways, Dr. Shane, again pictured here, is clear that the figures who offer us glimpses at neurodivergent Torah need not themselves be identified as neurodivergent. Like feminism or Hasidism, neurodivergent Torah offers a lens through which to view a text, even if the text itself was not produced by someone with that background. Clearly, there's incredible potential for neurodiverse perspectives to enrich us all in Torah learning. Friends, to go to a conclusion here, in expounding on neurodiversity in Torah, Rabbi Shais Taub reminds us that from one perspective, there's really nothing that could be considered neurotypical. By the way, I don't know why most of the people I'm quoting today are from the Orthodox world. There's been an explosion of Orthodox perspectives on this. I've seen less from the non-Orthodox world, but there's certainly some out there. But if you know of some, please share in our conversation today. So this fellow, who I also don't know, reminds us that from one perspective, there's really nothing that could be considered neurotypical. To be clear, he's not in any way dismissing the challenges, exhaustion, isolation, and disenfranchisement of living with neurodiversity. Rather, he's pointing out that, as our sages also tell us, each of us is completely distinct. We read in the Talmud that not just two faces are identical, that no two faces are identical, no two minds are identical. Interestingly, this is why the presence of a massive crowd of 600,000 Jews, right? You know this? If you're ever in a crowd of 600,000 Jews, the number of Jews who left Egypt, so we say, we make the blessing, blessed is God who knows secrets, right? We're going to get to secrets in another session. Very interesting, the psychology of secrets. But the bracha, if you find 600,000 Jews in one place, is blessed is God who knows secrets. Why? Well, I don't know, but perhaps because only God is able to see the unique mind of each of the 600,000 people present. As I said initially, I have no qualifications in deep expertise in these mental health or healthcare generally. So I'm only speaking from a rabbinic lens, not as a psychologist. But when I say there is no one right way to be. In the Talmud, we are also told, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'zeh, all Jews are responsible for one another. Take this to mean we're responsible for one another, not just in the financial sense, but in the sense of creating conditions where everyone feels seen, heard, and accommodated. I'm not going to pretend the issues of neurodivergence and differences in ability are ever simple in Torah or anywhere else, but I do know that the best of our traditions gives us an opportunity not only to treat every person with kindness and respect, but to learn from everyone. Okay, friends, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this topic. Oh, that's funny, Lauren. So the Waymo, by the way, I believe Phoenix was the first city. I don't know if it's in the world or just America where the Waymo was allowed to be driven. We were seeing it for a few years now already. There's now, I think, more than 3 cities. But anyways, yeah. Yes, hi, Matthew Newman.
So interesting thought. Very often a teacher goes 1, 2, 3, 5, because everyone knows step 4. But in reality, there are people who don't know. We just assume everyone knows culturally. I had a job over 40 years ago in which it was a big screw up on something, doesn't matter what. But my job was to interview the 7 different people and departments involved. And it turns out every single one had a different view of the process. And part of the issue gave me a lasting impression that you don't assume people know. And that when a teacher has to create an atmosphere where if someone doesn't know that 4 comes after 3 and before 5, they can ask the question. You can't talk down to people, but we make these assumptions that everyone knows something is happening. Everyone knows certain things, but that's really not true. It's cultural, it's intellectual. So if you were plopped down in Japanese society, you would do things differently. They do things differently than we do. You hand someone a business card in Japan as a sign of respect. You look at it carefully. In America, someone gives you a business card, you throw it in your wallet, and then you throw it away. So it's not just the diversity, it's how we look at people. We have to look at them and understand that not everyone thinks in the same way. I do a lot of mathematical tricks. I go 1, 2, 47 because I mentally know all the steps. That's what I was trained to do. I was just on the phone with someone this morning on business, and I had to stop and say, okay, let me walk through the process, how we got to that number. Because I've been trained myself. So it's not it's diversity, it's the person. We have to respect the other and look for the signs that we're going too far. I don't know if that makes sense in terms of this.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I think it's really relevant right now because in Arizona, the state that you and I live in, there's a major political debate happening right now around truancy, around chronic absenteeism in schools, and whether we should, what penalties ought to be for regards to truancy. If you're not in touch with that, Google it, and you'll see that that debate's happening right now in Arizona. Because people in a lower socioeconomic status, those kids tend to miss many more days of school. And what happens when you miss many days of school? Well, many things happen. But one of the things that happens is you miss certain lessons that are necessary to understand the next lesson. Like you're talking about steps 1, 2, 3, 5. And if you don't catch up on that reading lesson or that math lesson, you're never going to catch up. There's a missing piece of your puzzle that you'll never be able to put together. And maybe if you're wealthy, you can hire tutors, right? Or maybe there's if you're gifted, you can catch up. But other people simply can never catch up. And so, what do we do with that problem, where people fall behind early and never catch up? Matthew, were you about to jump back in?
Yeah, I was going to say the issue is a financial one because schools get paid on a per diem and students don't show up, they get less money. So the argument that you're going to penalize the parents and stuff has to do with the economics that, just because kids are in school, schools get a certain amount of money, almost like a per diem cap. And I think part of it is that, part of it is the educational, but there's a more interesting, if 10% of the kids don't show up and the school doesn't get the money, then what do you do? It's another.
You're saying a school receives less government funding if less students show
I
up?
believe that used to be the rule, and I
Oh,
don't know if it
interesting.
still is. It's something
Oh
that
no,
should
so
be checked.
it's not just about annual enrollment. You're saying it's about daily attendance that's tracked?
I believe
Oh,
that's the way it used to
oh, that's
be.
so
I don't
interesting. I
know
never knew
anymore.
that.
I
Oh,
don't
that's
know
fast.
anymore.
Oh, so that's part of why they're talking about financial punishments. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
But that's
fascinating. I
something
never
to
knew that.
look up. I don't know how the system works in Arizona, but I know
Yeah.
that's prior.
Okay. Very interesting. Okay, Cheryl. Hi, Cheryl.
Okay, there we go. First, hello, Hagsameach, everyone. Just to address your most recent point about attendance, I know so many school professionals who make sure that they get that the students show up on the first day. It's the first day where the enrollment is counted, and then at some point that's when the evaluation occurs. We've always contributed to an underserved school in South Scottsdale that our dear departed friend Marilyn used to teach at for many years, and they always went around and made sure the kids would show up on the first day because that was the day. I don't think it had to do with daily enrollment. I mean, that's an educational problem, not a financial problem. But just as far as that goes, that's how it used to be. And like Matthew said, I don't know if that's still the way it is. I wanted to comment on one other thing that you said about the 4 children at the Seder. We always talk about at our Seders that each of us is the 4 children. And so in that, we all possess those specific attributes that are outlined in the Haggadah. And so to that end, then, we probably might all be the neurodivergency, we might all have a piece of that in us. And also, to use your metaphor as the puzzle, there's certain points you can have a jigsaw puzzle that might have a piece missing in a very nondescript place, let's say some sky or something like that. But then you might have another one where the face of someone is missing, or something that that person is holding, or something that is critical. So I think it's often difficult to tell, and that I just feel that we all possess some aspect of that.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that. Yes, I love that read of the four children. And I love that sensitivity for us to carry. Thank you for that. And it's interesting. I mean, we might with people we're around, we may take a more, fixed mentality towards them, that some of the things that might bother or irritate us about some people, assume that it's not going to change. Where around ourselves, we might take a more open approach, that there are some things we can change. But how do we embrace that sensitivity, to both embrace that we are the four children and we're never not going to be, but also, take a growth orientation towards evolution as well, rather than just a fixed model. So yeah, so I love that thought. Yes, hi, Lauren.
Hi. One question and just a comment about something we have in our show. I'm wondering, with education of neurodivergent children, should they be like in smaller classes with special ed teachers, or are they better off with a regular class but with a teaching assistant to help them? So that's my question. What I've noticed is, I want to mention, and so I know there's different levels of neurodivergence. The Gabbai in Armenia, I go to a really small shul. It's like a modern Orthodox shtibel. It's great. And the Gabbai is probably autistic. He doesn't do well with social cues, and I know he sometimes wanders and talks to himself, but he's a Gabbai, and he sometimes leads services. He's totally welcome in the shul, and actually recently he led Shachrit on Shabbat, and I said to him afterwards, "Oh, Yesh Krok, you did a great job." And the next day, he never says anything to me. He just kind of looked at me and said, "Good Yantif," which is like, for him, a big deal, because we respect his space. But if you can bring them into a community, into a warm family, it's great. But anyways, I do have that question about education. Thanks.
It's a great question, and I'd love to hear others' views on it. I simply don't know.
Okay.
With every child, is it better that they're in a separate program or receive support and stay in the main program? A lot of people talk about that, and I'll leave that open as a question here. Maybe someone here has raised such a child or has served as a teacher for decades.
Okay.
But it's a great question, and I know one of the challenges in many of the Jewish day schools is they're not equipped to support either the, I guess what many call students who are special and students who are gifted on either end. In fact, a rabbi here in Phoenix, it's well known that his kids, are not attending the Jewish day school because they couldn't accommodate. So anyways, yes, it's a great question. I'll leave that open to others here.
Thank you. To everybody.
Thank you. And how nice that you complimented the Gabbai, because sometimes a compliment can totally change a relationship. People oftentimes think we don't like them, just, especially if we've been in the same community with them as years and never really spoken. And just one little compliment can transform a relationship. So I appreciate that insight.
Good morning, everyone. Just to be a little devil's advocate, if based upon your lecture that everybody may have a little neurodivergence on a spectrum. So if everybody is, quote, unnormal, because we've somehow as human beings decided what is normal, how do we and relating that back to what Cheryl said, where all of us are the four kids. How do we seem that we are continuing to separate more and more of society. So how do we ever bring society together if we keep not just dividing, but we continue to fragment more and more. For example, that rabbinate that you just mentioned, I don't remember her name in your lecture. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're autistic or a high functioning autist, have autism, you have to seem to look at the world from a sub perspective, because that's how you were treated. And I don't know, am I making sense? So we become so fragmented, especially in the very liberal world. How do we work together, not feeling that, well, maybe I have ADHD or
Okay.
maybe,
I'm sorry to cut you off. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not articulating it well, but I think you understand where I may be going with this.
Yes, totally. And I would love to open up this conversation. I think it's a really great conversation to have. Let me just share a reflection or two, and then I'd love to hear what people think. And to be sure, the current presidential administration has scrubbed off their website all issues of inclusivity around issues of neurodivergence, for example. Things that had to do with people who, the deaf, the blind, various, forms of disabilities or different abilities, and issues of mental health. They want nothing to do with this. They think this is all a distraction from the normal folks. And so that is one side of the problem. The other side of the problem is what you bring up in terms of the kind of ultra liberal world and kind of the fragmentation of identity. And, I think one of the things we're going to see, there's many things I disagreed with Rabbi Michael Lerner about. Rabbi Michael Lerner taught at VBM. He was a longtime public intellectual. Well, one of the phrases I think about often, he passed away a few years ago, maybe a year or two ago. And our former VBM board chair, David Lieberman, was fond of his ideas for many decades. In any case, he had an idea called the surplus of powerlessness. And the surplus of powerlessness means that when minorities feel disenfranchised, rather than attacking the most powerful, they attack other disenfranchised populations who are just slightly more powerful than themselves. And that becomes the breakdown of liberal movements, that rather than people say, oh, here's the oppressor up there, we're trying to resist, that down here you have now brown people attacking black people, attacking Jews, attacking other people in poverty, attacking queer people, and saying, I'm more powerless than you. You're more privileged than me, right? You're higher on this pole than me. And why do they do that? Because they feel safe. They feel safe attacking other disenfranchised groups as opposed to attacking the machine, right? And so I think that's one of the things we're seeing now in the progressive spaces is various minorities attacking other minorities. And that's also what's, I believe, push back if you disagree. That's also what I think is happening, is using the Jew. That's also what I think is happening by using the Jews and anti-Semitism to disenfranchise other minorities, right? Which might not be about combating anti-Semitism at all. It might actually or primarily be about attacking other groups and making it look like other minorities are doing it, making it look like Jews are getting people deported, right? When Jews are actually overwhelmingly pro-immigrant and pro-refugee. So I want to say that. But back to your main point, I think that you're exactly right. There's two different things that we want to do as healers of society. I mean, there's many things we want to do, but two on this topic, and then I want to hear folks on this. One is we want to show our commonalities. Say, wait a minute, I don't care if you're black or brown or gay or straight or born in Guatemala or Thailand. Like, we're human beings. We have so much in common. Stop talking about all these differences. We are the same. We're one family of humanity. That's one project, the project of commonality. The other project is the project of diversity, the project of honoring how different we are. Oh, I want to understand your culture. I want to understand your race. I want to understand your gender orientation. I want to understand your religious perspective, right? This project of healing a society by embracing diversity. Now, I think most are taking one or the other. One are saying that, look, we're the same. Forget all these differences. Let's not talk about that. We're just the same. And others want to dive into these differences and don't see the commonalities. I think the unique Jewish approach is to embrace both. How do we embrace our commonalities while also honoring these differences? And how do we do that in a politically polarized time that is both trying to pretend that there's one normal type that is to be celebrated and all these other differences are just are politically motivated, right? Anybody who's talking about difference anymore has some political motivation. We shouldn't be reading books about difference, right? We should just be gearing our society towards those who, fit into the quote unquote normal. So I'd love to hear more thoughts on Gary's profound question, because I think this question of neurodivergence and political polarization, I think, is so interesting. Yeah, Cheryl.
Okay, so we have, if we go with my thing, with my statement that all of us are neurodivergent, but we have one specifically neurodivergent grandchild, and the depends on where you are fortunate enough to live in what state now, as to what kind of education and services and things that you might get. So to your point, and to Gary's point, he is in a regular classroom, but he has an IEP and a team of people that he might get put into a reading group for somebody who is 2 or 3 years younger, chronologically younger than he is. He might get a different kind of treatment at PE. He might have an aide help him with ABC or XYZ, but he's still in the mainstream class with the other children who are very friendly to him. And these children are learning too that not everybody can, get out there on the soccer field and kick a goal, and that not everyone can do everything. And, we kind of elevate, even at a young age, we elevate those children who show more athletic prowess than others, So I would say that I'm glad that that he lives in a place where he has the kinds of care and attention that he needs. But I'm also very glad that he's mainstreamed, because I don't want to see him divided out. And that goes back to one of your very early points this morning, which shows the number of people identified in this case as autistic went from 1 in 36, what is now 1 in 36 children. But I totally agree that it's not even called autism anymore. It's called on the spectrum, because there's all sorts of different kinds of levels of attention or learning ability or physical things, compensations or lack of compensation. So I just think the diagnoses are different. And, I think that goes to what Gary was saying about how we just keep dividing further and further and further and isolating some of these things in an effort to think that we're helping, which we are, but, to what end? So
Yeah, thank you. And I feel such shame when I think back on my childhood on this point. I there's parts of my childhood I can't access my mind at all, and there's parts that are so clear. And I remember being a part of an athletic group of boys and having no sensitivity or understanding for the boys who were not athletic or athletically engaged. Like recess immediately to the field, and those boys who weren't there, it was like it didn't make any sense why they weren't there. And I remember this one boy who was so unathletic, and he finally was about to get a home run in this kickball game, and he was so desperate for this home run on a pavement on a pavement parking lot, that he slid home, like body first, like full body onto this pavement to like get this home run. He was so desperate, and I just at the time I just thought that was so weird. But I think about it all the time of this boy and like what it meant for him to get that, and it's just it's so. I mean, it could be so hard to be an adult, but it could be so hard to be a kid, and to think of boys. I mean, I have no idea what it's like for girls, but to be a boy who has very different athletic abilities is such a challenge. So yeah, and I hope school is different now than it was then. I have no clue. But looking at my boys, it doesn't seem it's very different. Anyways, thank you for sharing that. Hi, Mara.
Hi, everybody. Um, I I think girls are really mean. I'll just say that. But from my experience, but anyway, I have some pretty moderate to severe ADHD, I would say. I've managed it with mostly coffee since I was a kid. Never really liked the way medication made me feel. But as an adult, I see it as my superpower. Like I am able to, I'm a consultant, so I have 5 bosses at any given time. Right now, I'm also teaching graduate school, working on my doctorate, right? Like if I didn't have both a lot of skills from a lot of therapy and a lot of support and self-learning, as well as the neurodiversity, I wouldn't be able to do any of those things. And as far as where kids should be in school, that's one of the reasons I think, it really depends. When I think about someone like me or someone like my son, we really benefit from being in a structured environment where we can learn skills. There's no way I would be able to manage this many things if I didn't also know how to comply with the structure and have my own, rigor, to be able to stick to that structure and be successful, right? I always call it a superpower in my case, right? It could be disabling or it can also be empowering. And Rabbi, I see a little bit of that hyperactivity in you too, right? Like when I see all the things you're doing, right? Like, it can definitely be a strength.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And I love that. I do want to pick up on this point of mean girl culture. I wonder if you'll speak to that a little more because I certainly don't want to overgeneralize on it. But when I think back, I wonder how boys develop in regards to the relationship to girls in this regard, because I remember being afraid of girls as a kid. I didn't have girls who were friends. I didn't understand them. I didn't know them. I just remember them kind of giggling and pointing and being kind of afraid of them in a way that wasn't afraid of boys. Like I know boys are going to be mean. We're going to push each other, make fun of each other, but that didn't really hurt. It was the girls that kind of hurt. And I wonder like how boys are developing, you know, knowing that that's happening and what it's like on the vice versa. That's a whole subject in itself. But if you want to reflect on that, but I see like, I mean, just in personal experience, my boys are not, my boys are kept up a little bit at night from some boys who are mean, but the girls, I mean, they're really affected by, kind of mean girl culture. So I don't know what to say about that right now, but I don't know if you want to say more about that, Mara, or not, what you said.
I mean, right now, my boys are sweeties. They're both neurodiverse. They're 11 and 12, and they're still sweet, right? For as long as that lasts, I'll take it. But my son actually hangs out with girls. He prefers girls. I mean, he's got his Hebrew school friends, but at his public school, he's still hanging with the girls because they're sweeter and more positive. And I'm just waiting for that to change in middle school. It was hard for me, as a kid. But I think, some kids have, I hope that Avi has the right education to understand bullying when he sees it, right? And reflect on that. But
Yeah.
every kid is
Awesome.
different.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Sarah.
Hello. So I guess I want to reflect on a couple of things. One is that when I see the amount of diagnosed ADHD in the children for whom I'm a CASA, I realize that what is often not taken into consideration is that the ADHD is frequently a byproduct of the trauma. And I don't know that there are any children, or there are certainly an incredible minority who do not undergo trauma, and trauma is not addressed in our system. And at least for a lot of these kids, once they got therapy, the behavior changed. They didn't need medications. They didn't need a lot of other things, but their trauma really needed to be addressed. That's one thing. the other one is that with the explosion we've seen in diagnosed neurodiversity, I think that there is an element of wanting to belong somewhere and feeling as if we've perhaps never really fit in a way. And so it's been a boon to many people to be able to say that they now have a diagnosis of neurodiversity and you should be nice to me now because you never have before. And so in many ways, I see this as being a way of looking for compassion and empathy in our communities where it's been lost either to mean girls or nasty boys. As for me, I always hung out with the guys because I thought girls were kind of silly. And so it just felt better to hang out with guys. And of course, I had to abuse a lot of them in medical school because they were such jerks. But that's just the way it is. So those were my thoughts on what we've talked about. Thanks.
One question before you go on. What do you think about the often stated critique that we're overdiagnosing?
It's possible. On the other hand, since I don't know if we're talking about educationally or in some other way, but certainly in the educational sphere, and I'll say that from somebody who actually taught elementary school for a brief time before I went to medical school, we try to put all kids in one box and try to treat we are so overwhelmed by how many there are and the fact that, in our hearts, just like doctors would like to treat every human being as an individual and see them holistically, a teacher in a classroom with 40 kids is really at her wit's end to try and do that. And so I think that there is an element of that. And certainly I love IEPs. Practically every kid that I would have as a CASA will get an IEP because they've been through something and they need special kinds of attention, and they're not going to get it from the school systems, whatever school system, without that individualized educational program. And so it may be overdiagnosed, but in a way, it's the other side of throwing them all under the bus.
Yeah, great. And that's a good response to your a great question earlier, Lauren. So thank you all. This has been really rich. And by the way, on your point of trauma, not only their trauma, but the multi-generational trauma that, of course, is relevant as well. So friends, next week, we will be looking at conflict resolution. I know some of you are attorneys and have a lot of professional experience in conflict resolution, and we all, to some degree, in our families and workplaces and communities, are either experts at creating conflict or experts at resolving conflict. And so if you have expertise in creating conflict, we'll welcome your voice. And if you have expertise in resolving conflict, we'll welcome that as well. We're going to look at the psychological dimensions of how we help to be rodfei shalom, seekers of peace within various conflicts. See you then, and great to be with you all, and Chag Sameach.